Welcome back to the Late Reader. The lamp is lit. The window is open. The rain has not stopped. Settle in. Listen.
What happens when modern curiosity, armed with digital archives and a total lack of reverence, knocks on a tomb that was sealed for a very good reason? Dim your screens, check your locks, and let's dive into tonight's tale. The story of William Wraxall didn't come to us through old, leather-bound journals. It was compiled from a series of autosave drafts on a recovered Google Drive, left logged into a laptop in a rural Essex Airbnb.
Will was a digital nomad, a freelance journalist who made his living writing for obscure dark tourism blogs and history podcasts. He was a guy who thrived on the forgotten and the macabre. In the late autumn of 2023, Will was hunting down material for a new series on the dark history of the Swedish aristocracy. He rented a cabin in Västergötland near the historic Robeck Manor House.
Through some persistent email networking, Will had secured permission to access the manor's digitized archives. He spent his days in the estate's modern visitor center, scrolling through scanned 17th-century ledgers and translated diaries. But Will wasn't interested in crop yields or tax disputes. He was looking for dirt on the man who built the manor, Count Magnus de la Gardie.
Even in the sterile glow of a MacBook screen, Count Magnus leaped off the page. The family portraits showed a man of phenomenal ugliness, a harsh, jagged face with cold, dead eyes. The records painted him as a brutal landlord. Will read accounts of tenant farmers branded with hot irons for being late to work, and mysterious fires claiming the homes and lives of those who disputed the Count's land boundaries. But what really caught Will's attention was a local rumor he overheard at the village pub.
The bartender, a guy in his 30s wearing a heavy metal t-shirt, stopped wiping down the counter and stared at him. After a long silence, he leaned in. "The old people say the Count went on the Black Pilgrimage," the bartender whispered, "to a ruined city called Chorazin. They say he didn't come back alone." Will pressed for details, but the bartender shook his head. He only offered one story. Back in the 1970s, two poachers decided to hunt in the Count's private woods on the hill, a place locals still avoided.
Around midnight, people in the village heard a scream echoing from the trees. A scream, the bartender said, that sounded like a man's soul being twisted out of his throat. A few minutes later, from the edge of the woods, came a second sound. It was a laugh. But it wasn't a human laugh. When the sun came up, the police found the two men. One was alive, standing with his back pressed against a pine tree, frantically pushing his hands against the empty air, over and over, trying to keep something invisible away.
The other man was dead on the ground, and the bartender's voice dropped to a barely audible rasp when he told Will why it was a closed casket funeral. The flesh of the dead man's face had been entirely sucked away from the bone. To a dark tourism writer, this was absolute gold. Will was hooked. The next day, Will found a strange entry in a scanned ledger written in the Count's own hand. It was a fragmented diary about the Black Pilgrimage, mentioning a ritual to gain a faithful messenger and see the blood of his enemies.
Buzzing with excitement, Will packed up his laptop and walked back toward his cabin. His path took him past the village church. It was a beautiful, stark white building, but attached to its northern side was a copper-domed mausoleum, the final resting place of the de la Gardie family. Will found the door unlocked. He pulled out his phone, hit record, and stepped inside.
The mausoleum was grand, but Will's camera immediately focused on the center of the room. There sat three massive copper sarcophagi. Two were adorned with large metal crucifixes. The third, Count Magnus's tomb, bore no cross. Instead, the lid was engraved with elaborate, violent scenes. One etching showed a man running for his life through a forest. Behind him was a pursuer. Will zoomed in on his phone. The pursuer was short, muffled in a heavy hooded cloak. But reaching out from the cloak wasn't an arm.
The tomb was secured by three massive, antique steel padlocks. Will, feeling the arrogant thrill of the modern skeptic, walked right up to the copper box. Still filming, he knocked his knuckles against the metal. "Hey, Magnus," Will joked, his voice echoing in the cold dome. "Are you awake in there? I'd dearly love to see you."
He laughed at his own joke. Then Will noticed something. One of the heavy steel padlocks was lying on the stone floor. It hadn't been there when he walked in. Will assumed it had just rusted through, kicked it aside, and left the mausoleum,
completely unaware of the line he had just crossed. Will's flight back to London was booked for 2 days later. On his final evening, after a farewell dinner with his Airbnb hosts, he decided to take one last walk up to the churchyard to get some B-roll footage of the sunset.
The sky was a bruised liquid green. Will stood by the mausoleum. He couldn't resist one final look. He stepped inside the tomb, pulling out his phone. "All right, Magnus, I'm heading out," Will muttered to himself. "Maybe you weren't such a badass after all." As the words left his mouth, something heavy hit the toe of Will's boot. Clang. He looked down. It was the second padlock. Will froze. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing, stale, and smelled faintly of copper and dry earth.
Will's eyes darted to the sarcophagus. The third padlock, the final one, had popped open, and right before Will's eyes, the heavy copper lid of Count Magnus's tomb began to slowly, agonizingly slide upward. Will didn't stick around to film it. Panic, cold and primal, hijacked his nervous system. He sprinted out of the mausoleum, tearing down the path toward his cabin, not looking back. He threw his things into his suitcase, drove his rental car through the night to Gothenburg, and boarded a ferry to the UK, too terrified to wait for his flight.
Will's cloud-synced notes from the journey home are a descent into sheer terror. On the ferry, he obsessively counted the passengers. He noted that out of the 50 people in his section, only 48 ever showed up to the dining hall. The other 2 were always standing at the far end of the deck, facing out to sea. One was a very tall man in an archaic black coat. The other was a short figure, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low, concealing its face. Whenever Will tried to film them, his phone camera glitched, filling the screen with grey static.
When he landed in Harwich, Will didn't go to his London flat. He was convinced they knew where he lived. He rented a car, drove deep into the Essex countryside, and booked an isolated cottage in a village called Belchamp St. Paul. His final draft, saved at 9:14 p.m. on an August night, reads less like an article and more like a confession.
"They're outside," he typed. "They're standing under the street lamp at the crossroads. The tall one is just watching. The short one, its hood is shifting. There's something moving inside it. What have I done? The cops will think I'm high. I locked the door, but I can hear metal creaking. Is there no hope?" The notes end there. The local news didn't report much about what happened the next morning. A tourist found dead in a rental property. But rumors leak.
The paramedics who responded to the call had to take immediate psychiatric leave. The police report stated the cause of death was officially a heart attack, perhaps brought on by a severe animal attack. But the local mortician whispered a different story. He said Will Wraxall's body was perfectly intact, except for his face. There was no face left to identify, just bare bone, as if the flesh had been systematically, violently pulled away.
And that brings us to the end of tonight's dark excursion. M.R. James knew that true horror isn't just about jump scares. It's about the relentless, inevitable consequence of waking something that should have been left asleep. It doesn't matter if you have a smartphone in your pocket or a digital archive at your fingertips. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed.
That was the story. The lamp will still be on when you wake. New stories every Friday at the late hour. Until then, watch your reflection.